On the morning of the 28th of April, 1819, a British cavalry officer was hunting tiger in the hills of western India when he saw something across a ravine that should not have been there. An archway, cut into a cliff face, half swallowed by forest. Behind it were 30 caves, carved by hand out of solid rock and painted floor to ceiling with some of the finest work in the history of Asian art. They had been sitting in that gorge, largely undisturbed, for more than 1300 years. Within 50 years, they had begun to fall apart. Nobody attacked them, no army, no iconoclast, no earthquake. They began to fall apart because people arrived to save them. Over the next 100 years, 5 separate expeditions went into that gorge to rescue those paintings. The work of 3 of them was destroyed. Twice by fire in London, once by an earthquake in Tokyo. A 4th left a coating on the walls that is still there today. And the man who found the caves did the first damage himself within minutes of walking in. The gorge is a horseshoe. The Wagora River bends through it in a tight curve, and the caves are cut into the cliff above the left bank, 30 of them in a line, connected once by rock staircases running down to the water. Nothing here was built. Nothing was assembled. Every hall, every pillar, every ceiling was excavated, cut downward and inward into the basalt, stone removed until a room appeared. Sculpture and architecture in a single act. And no scope for error because you cannot put stone back. The work happened in 2 bursts, separated by about 400 years of silence. The first began around the 2nd century BCE under the Satavahana dynasty. 6 caves, numbers 8, 9, 10, 12, 13 and 15a, austere, nearly bare. And in these earliest halls, the Buddha is never shown as a person. He is present as a stupa, a dome of rock standing at the far end of the hall, and the monks walked circles around it in the dark. Then, for 4 centuries, nothing. The second phase is the one that matters for everything that follows. Under the Vakataka dynasty, the Basin branch, with their Asmaka and Rishika feudatories, the site erupted. Now the Buddha has a face, the walls fill with figures, courts, animals, dancers, kings, crowds. The pillars grow brackets and carving, and the painting begins. For a long time, it was assumed this second phase took a century or more. Then, an American art historian named Walter Spink spent decades reading Ajanta the way you would read a manuscript, cave by cave, chisel mark by chisel mark, watching styles shift, watching donors appear and drop away. His conclusion was startling. It is now the mainstream reading. Almost the entire second phase, more than 20 caves, was cut in about 20 years. 20 years under one emperor, Harishina. And then it stops. Harishina dies around the year 477. The coalition of donors and craftsmen his court held together comes apart. And the work at Ajanta ends. Not gradually, but mid-stroke. You can still see it. Caves 5, 24 and 29 were never finished. UNESCO points to them as the best surviving evidence anywhere of how rock-cut architecture was actually made, because the process was interrupted and never tidied up. Ceilings half-cut, pillars roughed out but never shaped, marks where a chisel was set down and not picked up again. What they left behind in the caves that were finished is the reason any of this is famous. The walls were prepared with mud plaster, finished smooth and painted once the surface was dry. Not true fresco that requires wet plaster. This is tempera on a prepared wall in a cave by lamplight. The most famous single image is in Cave 1, a figure holding a blue lotus. The head tilts, the eyes are lowered. Whoever painted it was working with light and shade to give that face volume. So it reads not as an outline filled in, but as a head turning in space. And the paintings are not decoration, they are narrative. Most of them tell Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, and they are painted as continuous scenes without frames. So a single wall carries an entire story that you read by walking along it. In Cave 26, the Buddha lies on his side, 7 meters of him cut from the rock, entering his final passing while mourners crowd the space below and celestial figures wait above. This is what sat in that gorge in the dark for 1300 years. Then the gorge goes quiet. Buddhism recedes from this part of India. The monastery is empty. The forest returns. Debris falls from the cliff above and piles against the cave mouths, season after season, until the floors inside lie buried several feet deep. And here is where almost every version of this story goes wrong. You will read constantly that Ajanta was lost for 1,000 years. It was not. In the 7th century, a Chinese pilgrim named Xuanzang wrote a description of a monastery cut from a cliff in this region. His own biography records no visit. Scholars think he never went there. Which means somebody told him. Somebody in the Deccan, in the 600s, knew this place well enough to describe it to a foreign traveler. 1,000 years later, the caves surface again. Mughal records from the court of Akbar describe rock-cut cave temples in this region, filled with images. That is more than 2 centuries before any European set foot in the gorge. And the communities living in these hills always knew where it was. When a British officer needed a guide through this country in 1819, a village boy took him to it. Ajanta was never lost. It was unrecorded. By scholars, by empires, by the outside world. Those are very different things. And the difference matters because the word discovery is about to do a great deal of work. April 1819. The officer's name was John Smith. The inscription he left describes him as a member of the 28th Cavalry. He crossed the ravine, climbed to the archway he had seen, and went in. What he entered was Cave 10, one of the oldest halls at the site, first phase, 2nd century BCE. Its early stupa still standing at the far end. Its pillars carrying painting added centuries after the cave itself was cut. And then he took something sharp and carved his name across one of them. John Smith, 28th. Cavalry, 28th April 1819. Cut into a painted figure on the 13th pillar. It is still there. You can read it today. There is a detail about that signature that most retellings leave out, and it is the most eloquent thing at Ajanta. It sits about 7.5 feet up the pillar. Smith was not a giant. He could not have reached that high from the floor because he was not standing on the floor. He was standing on 13 centuries of accumulated rubble that had raised the ground level inside the cave. When the caves were cleared out later, the debris was carted away. The signature stayed exactly where it was, and it now sits stranded up the pillar, above head height, out of anyone's reach. That piece of graffiti is a measurement, a physical record of precisely how deeply Ajanta had been buried, cut by the man who unburied it, in the act of defacing it. One more thing about the discovery, since we are being accurate about it. Smith told people, but he never published. The first published account of the paintings came from a different officer, a Scot named James Alexander, who visited in 1824. and wrote the caves up for a European readership. Smith gets the credit because he got there first and left his name on a wall. Alexander did the work that actually brought Ajanta to the world, and almost nobody says his name. The news traveled. And with it came a problem everyone saw immediately. The paintings were fading, and there was no way to take them anywhere. So the decision was made to copy them. In 1844, the Madras government commissioned an army officer named Robert Gill. Gill went into that gorge and never really came out. He arrived in early 1845 and worked there for 19 years. He measured, he mapped, he photographed, and he painted copies of the principal murals at close to full size, canvas after canvas, by lamplight, in caves with bad air and resident bats. By 1863, he had roughly 30 of them. They were shipped to London and exhibited at the Crystal Palace. In 1866, the Crystal Palace caught fire. 5 survived. 4 of them are in the Victoria and Albert Museum today. 19 years of one man's working life. 5 canvases. Here is what Gill did next. He went back into the gorge and started again. He was still at Ajanta 13 years later. In April 1879, he fell seriously ill and was carried out towards Busawal. He died on the road. He is buried in the European cemetery there. The loss was serious enough that the whole project was restarted from nothing. From 1872, a painter from the Bombay School of Art named John Griffiths took 7 Indian students to Ajanta and spent every winter there for 13 years. Between them, they produced around 300 paintings. 125 were sent to the South Kensington Museum in London. In 1885, the South Kensington Museum caught fire. 87 of them burned. They had been photographed first. That is the only reason anyone knows what was in them. Then, in 1909, a third attempt, and a different kind. Christiana Herringham was an English painter and a suffragist. She came to Ajanta with a team and worked across 3 seasons, copying in tempera, closer to the original technique than the oils Gill and Griffiths had used. The team matters, so let us name it. Dorothy Larcher, a British artist, and 5 students from the government art schools of Bombay and Calcutta. Syad Ahmad, Muhammad Fazil Uddin, Samarendranath Gupta, Asit Kumar Haldar, and Nandalal Bose. Hold on to that last name. In June 1911, the copies went on public exhibition in London, at the Crystal Palace, the same building where Gill's had burned 45 years earlier. The work was published in 1915 by the India Society, under the title Ajanta Frescoes. The title is wrong, incidentally. The murals are not fresco. And the book contains not one reflection from the Indian artists who painted the copies inside it. But the copying had been doing something to the caves themselves. To make the murals easier to see and easier to copy, and to shield them, they believed, from the monsoon. The copyists brushed varnish across the paintings, repeatedly, over decades. Caves 9 and 10 worst of all. The varnish did brighten the colors, briefly. Then it hardened. It contracted as it aged, and where it contracted, it lifted pigment off the wall with it. And because every hour of work in those caves was done by lamplight, the fresh varnish drank the smoke. Year after year of it, until a dark, greasy film lay across the surface. In 1916, a Japanese painter named R.I. Campo came to Ajanta. He had been invited to India by Rabindranath Tagore, and he worked differently from everyone before him, copying the murals onto Japanese tracing paper rather than canvas. He also recorded exactly what he found on those walls, whole surfaces coated in varnish. Greasy to the eye, The colors no longer what they had been. 60 years of rescue had produced a layer of grime that was now part of the painting. Campo took his copies home. They were stored at Tokyo Imperial University. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake destroyed them. 3 sets of copies: London 1866, London 1885, Tokyo 1923. Fire and earthquake on 2 continents across 57 years. By this point, it is difficult not to feel that something is refusing to be copied. In 1920, the caves lay within the territory of the Nizam of Hyderabad, and his director of archaeology brought in 2 Italian restorers, Professor Lorenzo Cecconi and Count Orsini. They worked for 2 years. They stripped off what old varnish they could reach. They cleaned away the smoke. They stabilized the flaking paint by injecting casein behind it. Genuinely advanced work for its date, and it prevented an enormous amount of loss. And then they sealed the surface with a coating of shellac. They could not remove every earlier layer first. So on some walls, Victorian varnish is still sitting underneath. The shellac worked. It is a large part of the reason these paintings survived the 20th century at all. It has also, across the last 100 years, gone dark. There are no villains in this story. Smith was careless, and Smith is the reason anyone came at all. Gill lost 19 years of work in a single afternoon and went back for more. Griffiths and his students preserved 300 images of paintings that have degraded since. Cecconi and Orsini stopped the paint falling off the wall. Every one of them did competent work in good faith, with the best materials available to them. And every one of them left a layer. The coating that saved these paintings is now one of the main reasons you cannot see them. Ajanta became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983. It is managed by the Archaeological Survey of India, and among the threats UNESCO formally lists for it, alongside loose boulders and structural stability, is this one: visitor pressure in the painted caves. The paintings are still there. They are dimmer than the day Gill first held a lamp up to them, and far dimmer than the day they were finished. The most reliable record anyone has of them is not a painting at all. In the late 1920s, the Nizam sent his leading art historian, Ghulam Yazdani, to make the first full photographic survey of the caves. The photographs outlasted every set of painted copies. But something else survived, and it is not an object. Remember the name: Nandalal Bose, one of the 5 Indian students who sat in those caves in 1910, copying murals for a book that would not print his thoughts. He went on to become one of the most important artists in modern India, principal of Kala Bhavana at Santiniketan. And in 1949, he and his students were given the original manuscript of the Constitution of India and asked to decorate it by hand. 22 illustrations in gold leaf and stone color, running through the founding document of an independent country. The paintings at Ajanta faded. Every canvas copied from them burned or shook apart. But the way of seeing survived, carried out of that gorge in the hands of a student nobody credited, and painted into the first pages of a new republic. And in Cave 10, 7.5 feet up the 13th pillar, cut across the body of a figure painted 1500 years ago, there is a name. It has not faded. It is, by a considerable distance, the most legible thing on that wall.